All right, colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you so very much for joining us in this session. Thank you to our speakers who have agreed to come and talk to us this afternoon. This program today, or this activity today, came about 2 months ago when we interacted with some colleagues from different regions across the world, trying to see to it how do we come to share our own experiences to our students, our postgraduate students in particular, given the current challenges, that have come with being in a remote learning dispensation as a result of these COVID-19 related regulations and restrictions. And we're quite honored, we're quite humbled by the response that we've received from different people. We started from the 24th of May with our postgraduate seminar series where we had different speakers from different universities. As I said, we had a speaker from Florida, we had one from Nigeria, we had another several others from different universities in South Africa, UNISA, Fordham, University of Pretoria, and we are quite excited to having established these linkages. We can see what is forming now, this community of practice that is forming now. It's quite exciting, and we are looking forward to these types of talk sessions. But coming to today, Dr. Isabelle Zaugg, she's a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in New York, and she expressed interest to come and talk about decolonizing communication studies. There are various things that she would be talking about. I don't want to come into that, but what I like about today's conversation, it forms part of what seems to be a coordinated action or a coordinated effort from across our continent. Various academics, researchers, activists, they are taking over this baton of trying to Africanize our scholarship, trying to decolonize our views. You would remember, or maybe some of you might know, that the likes of your Achima Shebe, Mafeje, who was one of the critics of, within anthropology circles, one of the critics of European westernized scholarship that has entrenched its way and their modes of inquiry on Africans. And he was calling for African theories, African perspectives as a response to what seems to have been scholarship that is laden, that is laced with European thinking, Eurocentric worldviews. So we are taking cue from those kind of contributions, and I'm quite excited, and I hope that what we're going to be learning from today would not necessarily just be one of those things that we talked about, but at least we are able to take forward, especially our students, in the different research expeditions that we have. Maybe we might be able to start to refocus our work, trying to advance an African scholarship. By so saying, I just wanted to welcome you all, but let me now take this moment to acknowledge Dr. Tsietsi Mutle, to just introduce Professor Lynette Fourie, who's going to just open the session for all of us. And we are quite indebted to Professor Lynette Fourie, who, when we took this idea to her, she welcomed us with open hands. And for that, we are grateful. Dr. Mutle.
Thank you, Dr. Mulale. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this important event on decolonization. And I want to perhaps just start from where Tsepang has left off. in relation to what Achi, Majefe, and the likes have contributed, and which culminate into what we are attempting to do today. And simply to start by saying, or rather quoting what Frantz Fanon once said, that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and fulfill it or betray it. Now, it is upon us to ensure that we at least attempt to fulfill a particular mission or to betray it. And ours is to say, therefore, with this important conversation from Dr. Isabelle, that we attempt, therefore, to bring issues that need to be taken into cognizance forward. We are attempting to start a discussion, a conversation around the decolonization project, which by and large, and from every corner now of the world, including here in Africa, scholars have begun now to take heed into this call to say, let us begin this conversation. Let us now attempt to understand what decolonization means, particularly in our context as Africans. Most importantly, therefore, colleagues, I welcome all of you, and I hope that you would be able, therefore, to enjoy this session, which is to be delivered by Dr. Isabelle. My task at the moment, it's simple, it's to afford Professor Lynette, who is our research director in the NTT Social Transformation, the Faculty of Humanities, an opportunity to welcome everybody. Professor Lynette.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mutley. Welcome to all here. Thank you for your time. I know it's late on a Friday afternoon, but everybody here just shows me how passionate you are about the topic that we're going to discuss this afternoon. I'd like to really welcome you on behalf of Social Transformation, the research entity, where we do focus our research on social transformation. So this is very aptly fitting for the entity also to host this lecture this afternoon. I will do my thank yous at the end. For now, I think let's get the show on the road.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much for that. Yes, why don't we get this show on the road? Colleagues, Dr. Isabelle Zaugg, as I told you where she hails, or she's currently in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Her research investigates the relationship between the gaps in support for digitally disadvantaged languages and patterns of mass extinction of language diversity. A primary focus has been studying the digital history and online vitality of the East African languages that utilize the Ethiopic script. Her research addresses the extent to which the script and its languages are supported in the digital sphere, including tracing the history of its inclusion in Unicode. She has proposed policy, governance, and advocacy solutions to better support digitally disadvantaged languages, in turn supporting her long-term survival, their long-term survival. She also addressed the risks of surveillance and the need for robust content moderation for digitally disadvantaged languages as they move up the ladder of full-stack digital support. Colleagues, I would like to present to you Dr. Isabelle Zaugg to come and talk to us about her presentation. Izzy, over to you. Sorry, Izzy, you're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You would think after so many months we would all know how to use Zoom, so apologies for that. So let me start over and just say thank you so much to Dr. Molale, Dr. Mutele, and all of the colleagues at Northwest University for inviting me today to join you for this presentation, and for all of the people who are taking time out of your Friday afternoon to join. And I hope this will be, my presentation is a starting point for a larger discussion, and I look forward to hearing from, everyone in the group and about your ideas on this topic as well. So let's see, let me share with you my screen. Am I okay, perfect. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. So my talk today is about decolonizing communication research. And my goal today is to think about a number of the layers at which kind of coloniality still exists within our communication sphere, especially within our sphere of digital technologies and data practices, and as well as to identify new horizons of practice. And with this talk, I really draw on many, many other people's work. This is actually a field that I'm really interested in reading more material, learning more. And, you know, I had originally volunteered to actually have a discussion with Dr. Mulale's class. And so, you know, when he asked me to formal lecture, you know, it took me a little bit to decide, because this is you know, I'm going to be sharing some of my own research, but I'm also going to be linking that to many other people's ideas. And I hope it will be, for those of you maybe familiar with the topic, maybe you'll find some new interesting avenues for your own further research. For those who maybe this is a new topic, hopefully this will provide an interesting introduction to very kind of urgent and very timely conversations about decolonizing the field of communication and many other fields and kind of spheres of life as well. So my presentation topics today, I'm going to be starting out by doing a bit of introduction to myself and my work, as well as kind of setting up a theoretical framework for what I'll be speaking about today. And then like I said, my kind of two main areas of discussion will be kind of excavating the layers within communication technologies. So we can kind of think about as scholars, be it, you know, student scholars or more established scholars, you know, how might we kind of interrogate these different layers and try to bring out maybe new insights about, you know, new insights from a more decolonial perspective. And then also new horizons of research, pedagogy, and sort of building our field in a way that reflects, you know, the world that we'd like to see. And I think this is really a project of collective imagination. And I hope that this presentation really kind of, you know, encourages and fosters that imagination through discussion as well. So a little bit about my professional background. I have a PhD in communication from American University in DC. Any of you who are master's students who are thinking about continuing on to a PhD, I really recommend the program and would be happy to be in touch if you have questions. I also have a background in filmmaking, and as well as a bachelor's in art and semiotics. And so I have a real love for visual culture and the arts, as well as, you know, thinking about how you know, digital technology meets our digital sphere. And I want to give a quick shout out to Abel Tillahoon. You'll see a lot of his art throughout this presentation. I love his work. He's also happens to be my husband, and I like to, you know, we have so many conversations between his practice and my scholarly practice. And so y'all get to enjoy some of his artwork today as part of my presentation. And then in terms of my career, I kind of place my work within critical traditions, as well as digital studies and kind of history of science traditions as well. And Ethiopia has really been a research focus as well as a home for me. I have had 2 Fulbrights here. You know, my PhD dissertation was focused in Ethiopia, and if you add up, I've lived here for about 8 years. In terms of my work at Columbia, my first 2 years as a postdoc, I helped to lead a Mellon Sawyer seminar on global language justice, which was a really amazing chance to really engage with the topic of language justice and bring just fantastic guest speakers and advocates, activists, community leaders from indigenous and minority language communities from across the world to Colombia, as well as poets. And that was really kind of also a formative experience for me. And then in the last couple of years, I've been working at Columbia's Data Science Institute. I love to teach. I have developed a few classes at Columbia, including a cross-disciplinary course I teach with a natural language processing professor. And I also help, I do research and help lead the Collaboratory at Columbia program, which helps foster new cross-disciplinary courses that bridge data science with the humanities and social sciences and, you know, the medical fields and all the departments across Columbia's campuses. And really a through line of both my work, my teaching, my research has really been a focus on equity and justice within different spheres, technology, education, as well as visual culture. So before we get started, I think it's important to kind of set up a little bit of our theoretical framework when we use these terms. What are we kind of thinking about? And so I've drawn a few different quotes here about coloniality. So for example, Winston Mono and Viola Wilton argue that coloniality has survived colonialism. So, you know, when we talk about decolonizing, we're not solely referring to kind of the colonial period, which has been, you know, in African context, we've had decades of, you know, time post-colonial, but we're really thinking about sort of more the themes and the threads of power that continue to shape our world today. And here's another quote from Stefania Milan and Emiliano Trere. The historical processes of dispossession, enslavement, appropriation, and extraction that are still central to the emergence of the modern world are really, you know, sort of the core of coloniality. And here's a quote from Paula Ricarte. Colonialism and neocolonialism should be understood in terms of their effects on power relations across borders and the reproduction by technocrats, universities, and governments within borders of colonized countries. These forms of oppression should be seen through the lens of their effects on the bodies, affects, and territories of marginalized and multi-ethnic populations. We must identify how the multiple dimensions of colonization are interwoven and deployed as an internal, international, and transnational process that perpetuates exploitation, the extinction of alterity, and the diminishment of life on Earth. There's quite a wide net that she's casting. You know, we're talking about, you know, a wide range of power relations that are really affecting our globe. So what about our you know, proposed decolonization? What does this mean? So Adams, you know, in a very clear way says this is undoing the legacies of colonialism and logics of race. Again, Mono and Wilton say it's a continued questioning of the relevance of theory and practice amidst changing global world orders. And they ask, how can scholarship and curricula undo lingering colonial legacies and contribute to a humanizing development? And I would propose that that the kind of core of decolonizing is increasing the value of human life, and to quote Mono and Wilton, in conditions of dignity everywhere. And I think it's important to also bring out a theme that many scholars touch upon, which is that decolonizing is not a destination, it's a journey, it's a struggle. You know, it's not something that's going to be easy necessarily, it's going to take time. But it also gives us some peace to think that if just because maybe today we're not, you know, we're not where we want to be, it doesn't mean that we can't move forward in this journey. And I really liked, the words earlier, that part of the introduction talking about as a generation, we have to, you know, discover what is our calling and what can we actually contribute to this world. And so for me, this process is very important, not only for those who have been the ones who really have suffered the most under coloniality, but also for those who have benefited from it. And I would consider myself in that category. I mean, I think for myself, I would say I'm sure I have also had, there's negative parts of life that come from coloniality for myself, but I've benefited. I've had a lot of forms of privilege, be it education. I have US citizenship, which allows me to travel the world, and these kind of related things. But, I really feel that living equally with all of humankind is a really important part of, having peace and having self-knowledge and learning as well from the world. Because if we have a misconstrued sense of kind of centrality that has gone along with Western ways of knowing, Western knowledge, we're also losing out on so much, knowledge, wisdom, ways of tackling problems in the world that we're just missing because we're blind to it. And I think it's important that we build up relationships of equality and peace and justice in this world. And I also see this decolonization as a journey. It's not that we take together. It's not necessarily something that we can do individually. We have to partner and collaborate on this, and we all bring our own knowledge and experience to this. And I hope that my talk will foster reflection, imagination, and discussion, both as part of this event as well as in the future. So a little bit more about my personal background, just to give you maybe a little bit of context when we talk about, we all bring our own set of knowledge, right? Where do I come from? So I grew up in the San Luis Valley in Colorado. These were traditional lands, mostly hunting and grazing lands of Native American communities, including the Apache, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and Navajo. This part of the Southwest US was once part of Mexico, and there I grew up with many Hispanic people who were the descendants of settlers who were, who lived there when it was part of Mexico, and then this part of the US was then taken later by the US after the Mexican-American War. And it was a very beautiful rural place to grow up. I grew up in a very small community, and I value a lot of the community kind of values and sort of less of a focus on materialism and more of a focus on sort of what I think are the things that really matter in life, family and community and service and things like that. I had a really formative experience as a young person. I was selected and given a scholarship to go to the United World College of the Adriatic, which is an international high school in Italy, where I studied with students from around 70 countries. You can see a photo. This isn't from my generation actually, but this is, every year you have just students from all over the world. And it opened my eyes to a lot of, just the way that people live around the world and how interconnected our issues are. So I remember, for example, many of my classmates staying up all night to find out the results of the US election. And I was just amazed. Why would people care who the US president is? And as I would have conversations, I understood that actually who the US president was and their policies would probably impact some of my classmates in different parts of the world far more than it would change my life. Anyway, that was an experience that really made me love travel and learning about people's different experiences and connecting those with my own. And I took that and then studied abroad at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia as an undergraduate, and learned Amharic, which is the national language of Ethiopia, built friendships, eventually married one of my classmates there, and really began making Ethiopia home. And I went on to continue learning about, these ties between African realities and the US and other global, and the things that I was studying during my graduate education. And I also really want to credit, beyond my, all of my studies in various institutions, all the things that I've learned from my mentor, Memher Tesfaye Shawaye, who taught me many things and really gave me a lot of insight into life. So how is that kind of translated into my research and teaching focus? As Dr. Molale spoke about in the introduction, I've really made language justice in the digital sphere my focus. I look at scripts. Here in this image, you see pictures of, or excuse me, an artwork that is actually an embroidered door with Ethiopic characters. So these are used to write Amharic as well as the classical language, ancient classical language of Ge'ez. It's a script that is endemic and unique to Ethiopia. It's also used in Eritrea. And it's a really amazingly rich script that holds a lot of knowledge within it. It's a syllabic script, so you can use it to write characters, to write words phonetically, but each character also has its own meaning within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. And so I've looked at what is the history of people's efforts, both in Ethiopia and the diaspora, to make sure that digital technologies can be, that you can write in this script using your phone and your computer. And it's been really interesting to see the grassroots efforts that made that possible, as well as kind of partnerships between some of these early digital activists or technologists who also partnered with, for example, Unicode to make sure that it was a script that could be used globally, ubiquitously on all mainstream devices and websites. And the work continues. We still see digital vitality for languages that use the Ethiopic script, such as Amharic, but we still see a lot of people who transliterate into Latin characters, A, B, C, D, because they don't have access to convenient keyboards, or they don't know how to download, etc. So there's still work to be done. And in my on my part-time efforts, I also help with an effort, for example, to develop layout standards for Amharic so that word processing and websites can handle the script properly. So to kind of give us a base to think about, how does power relate to technologies? I like to use this image. I refer back to Langdon Winter Scholarship often, and he has a really great essay about the question, do artifacts have politics? And so, we tend to think just on the surface, we may say, well, technology could be used for good or bad, but beyond that, it doesn't really contain politics within it or power within it. But what Winner and many others have kind of elaborated on is how technology, by way of its design, it actually makes certain things possible and other things impossible. And as such, we have winners and losers that are sort of determined by the technological affordances. And kind of a metaphor would be this bench, these park benches. This style of bench is very common in public parks in the US. And I often ask my students, why is there an armrest in the middle of a bench? And usually there's someone who knows, and the answer is that it's designed so that homeless people cannot sleep on the bench. If you are someone who just wants to sit, have your lunch, take a moment of rest, you can use the bench. But if you actually want to sleep on the bench, you can't. So this is an example of how technology basically, or an artifact, in this case a chair, was designed, so that basically, people who have at least some level, at least they have a home, they can rest, but people who would sleep cannot. And when we kind of compare that to our digital technology, you could think about what are the ways that our communication technologies allow certain people to, for example, communicate in English, but not communicate in maybe another mother tongue language that isn't well supported. And we see a lot of companies, I'm going to go into this more later, but we see tech companies presenting themselves as very universal, they serve mankind, and they're saying chairs are like Facebook, right? And they kind of present themselves like a UN, and the chair is very universal and it serves everyone. But actually we know that in fact, not everyone actually sits on chairs around the world, right? And also, not every chair, we think of our park bench, is actually designed for everyone to use. And we need to kind of take that critical thinking to our digital technologies and think about who is left out and who is served. And one of the areas that I've focused on is really digital language extinction, where when people are not able to use their language in the digital sphere, they're usually forced to make a choice to use a second, more dominant language, such as English, when they're, let's say, writing emails or text messages, or maybe a different script. Maybe they have to change, instead of writing in Arabic, they would write an ABCD just to kind of phonetically represent their language. And they also lose a sense of prestige with their language because, our technologies have a lot of prestige associated with them. And eventually, especially for young people, they lose competence often with their languages. And so our technology, because of how they're designed and what they allow and don't allow, they can actually have a lot of kind of knock-on impacts in the real world. So Dr. Molale, can you play this video for me of the dance you robots?
Okay, please stop sharing so I can do so.
Yes. Thank you. So I brought that video as an example. I don't know if maybe some of you have seen it in late December. It was released, and I thought the reaction to this video was quite telling, actually, in terms of thinking about how technology serves some and then could become either unusable or even a threat to others. And what I saw with the reaction to this was that, people who, for example, have lived in police states or feel targeted by, police enforcement or under the threat of war, as soon as they saw these robots, they thought, oh my goodness, this could be used against us, right? Whereas if you look at the video, it's talking about how these robots are designed for, search and rescue. They're designed for factories, very kind of like peaceful activities. But, many people are quite aware that often technologies that are designed under the guise of sort of peaceful activities go on to be used for other ends, such as, let's say, drones, for example. Whereas people who, who have more, let's say, are in more of a privileged context, which may see this video and think, wow, that's so exciting, how great that, this kind of innovation is happening, and this is going to be something, this is going to bring, maybe brighter future for my children, more safety, more security, it can be used for all kinds of issues. And another issue on the other side would be thinking about, okay, so in countries where we have, let's say Ethiopia, where we have 75% of the country is 25 years or younger, what does it mean that we're automating factories, right? What about workforce development? So this is just an example of how, you know, as this quote from that Ruha Benjamin borrows from Margaret Atwood, better but never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some. So I'm going to be looking at technology through that kind of a lens throughout this talk. And when we look at the, you know, we think about these robots, maybe that's a bit far from communication technology, but they're still very much built on AI technologies, which are very much linked with our with machine learning and learning about how, you know, humans and animals behave, how they communicate, how can we understand what they're thinking, how can we have human machine interaction, for example. We can also see kind of colonial patterns of power dynamics in the hardware and software defaults and affordances. And this draws on some of my own research. You know, we see, for example, digital software, hardware built with English and Latin script defaults, such as the QWERTY keyboard, which you see all over the world. Even in contexts such as China, where, you know, there's a very rich character set and a strong presence of Chinese, people are still using the QWERTY keyboard to type in and then convert to Chinese characters. And I kind of put this Simpsons image kind of as it's kind of a joke, of course, like imagine a Chinese keyboard with, you know, maybe hundreds or thousands of characters. Of course, it's not practical, but to have a physical keyboard like that, it's very difficult to design something that's usable. And there's actually, you know, there's a book called The Chinese Typewriter about kind of history of efforts to do that. So great minds have worked on that issue. But today, you know, and there have also been arguments that, well, everyone should just switch to the Latin characters because it's so much more convenient to just put those few characters on a keyboard, and with digital technology, wouldn't it be so much easier to use Latin rather than, let's say, Ethiopic, you have 300 some characters. Well, as of today, thanks to predictive typing technologies, people can type in Chinese, you know, a mother tongue Chinese speaker can type more quickly in Chinese on a smartphone than a native English speaker can type in English. So we need to be really careful about thinking whether we're asking people to change to fit the technology or whether we're actually innovating so that the technology can fit the needs of the people who are using it. And unfortunately, you know, we see often, you know, a lot of our tech is driven by market logic, which means that wealthy communities are served while others are not. And we see a lot of kind of examples of this. We see content moderation severely lacking in African and Asian languages, which can lead to, you know, this kind of spread of misinformation or calls for violence. Which are not being, you know, flagged the way they would be if they were in English and not being reviewed. We also see a lack of language support on major platforms for all but a few globally dominant and largely our colonial languages. And we see also, for example, privacy policies on social media are either not translated into languages that people, you know, are speaking, or they do not match the cultural conceptions of privacy, making people more vulnerable to sort of not knowing how to set their privacy settings, and therefore maybe being open to bullying or abuse or sort of leakage of private information to parties that they wouldn't want to share that with. And so I wanted to share a few graphics just to give you a sense of how languages and digital technologies, the kind of imbalance that we see, sort of legacy of colonial kind of language power dynamics. So of course we see, you know, when we look at the languages that are supported online, you know, there's this on the upper right, we see, you know, shift from 2012 to 2015. We see, you know, a jump a little bit with Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Wikipedia, Google, but we're still, you know, when we think that there's around 6,000 to 7,000 languages currently, and of course it's always a question of what's a language and what's a dialect, and that's about power as well, right? But we still see that this is quite a small number. And we also, when we look at the most commonly used languages on the internet, I found this graphic. It has maybe 20 languages here, not a single African language listed as kind of coming up, or an indigenous African language listed coming up, and kind of vying for space with some of these more dominant international languages. And some of the use, the lack of use, again, is people shifting to English or shifting to French, Portuguese, because it's easier, or because maybe they don't have the input method to do that. They don't have to fight with autocorrect when they're trying to write their own, their own mother tongue, because it's always changing their language into English, for example. So we see how the tools are shifting us towards sort of these patterns that really we've inherited from colonialism. If we look at Google Translate as an example, back in 2015, there was only one African language that was supported by Google Translate. Now we have 13. But again, that's only 12% of Google Translate's coverage, whereas Africa has about a third of global languages, an amazingly rich language diversity. And here you can see the map of language diversity versus the map of kind of Google coverage. I've listed the languages that are supported there. And while quality of translation is improving, it's relatively low compared to other language pairs that have had a lot more work and a lot more corpus to support the development of the translation tools. It used to be that on Google Translate, you could only translate to English from these languages. Now you can translate from any language to any language that Google supports. However, what you don't see behind the scenes is that English is the pivot language in almost all cases. And so this is still kind of using English and the sort of the limitations of English in terms of translation from languages that may be quite different from it. That limitation is there. So, if you wanted to translate, like in Ethiopia, let's say from Amharic to Oromifa, you would be going through English. Well, Oromifa is not supported here, but let's say you're going from Zulu to Afrikaans, you would still almost certainly be going through English, which is still, of course, a limitation. And I put a little example of a Google Translate here from English to Amharic. Professor, you are the best. And if what you see here is that the translation system, as opposed to English, Amharic has a respectful, a way of respectful address, but here it's not using that, it's using the familiar address, as well as it's assuming that the professor is male. So we also have a risk that these systems may kind of degrade the integrity of languages, African languages or others, as well as sort of the culture of manners and politeness and the kind of specific social relationships that are actually built into the languages, because those don't exist in English or because there's bias in the data. Now, when we look at the level of communication infrastructure, we also see colonial patterns that are persisting. So on the left, we see a map of telegraph lines, and the telegraph was originally invented as a way to basically, continue to lead and dominate the colonial territories from Europe over great distances. So how do we send messages quickly, right? So the telegraph was invented, and today we see on the right are internet pipelines, still very much mapping those same pathways and those same kind of power centers. And we know that these pipelines, sometimes we have people who are looking at data that passes through these. And so having data that passes through certain countries, be it the US or European powers, it gives a certain advantage in terms of surveillance of this data. And actually, I'll go back for a moment. So I have this quote here from Nick Holdry, and he talks about how data practice are affected by the continuation of neo-colonial power relations. But But then he goes on to say that his stronger claim is that what is happening today with the appropriation of data from the stream of human life across the planet is an event, a transformation of world historical significance, which can be compared in importance with the original land grab of historical colonialism, because it changes entirely the power relations regarding the world's resources, a new phase of colonialism, which he calls data colonialism. So he's really arguing that there's not just this legacy that we kind of continue to live with, but there's also this new form of power that can be compared to colonialism because of the way that it extracts and it consolidates power. And another quote here for Anibal Quijano: we are reaching a watershed moment in the global coloniality of power, with the manipulation and control of technological resources of communication and of transportation in order to impose the technocratization, instrumentalization of coloniality, modernity, together with the mercantilization of subjectivity and life experiences of individuals. So to kind of translate, we're talking about, again, very much reflecting the quote earlier, this kind of watershed moment where power is being consolidated through manipulation and control, and this basically the buying and selling of subjectivity and life experiences. And now, and actually, okay, let me back up for a moment. So I have an image here of a refugee, someone who is, you know, a migrant on the move, maybe trying to move from one place of, you know, unsafety to a place of safety or promise. And what we're seeing with data extraction is that, you know, for example, on borders now, let's take the US Mexico border, there are phone towers that they're actually basically false phone towers that can, when people log on to them and use the internet there, then the government can surveil their social media and their text messages, and their data is being used to determine their immigration opportunities when they're applying for asylum, for example. Biometric data is often collected by the UN or other humanitarian agencies, facial recognition, fingerprints, and sometimes that data it's often then also shared with the tech companies who are providing the technology as a service, and it gets incorporated, let's say, into their facial recognition software, improving that software's ability to recognize faces from that ethnic group, let's say. And sometimes that software is then sold back to the governments who are trying to prevent these refugees from coming into their borders. Okay, so this is a kind of stark example of how our data can be used, can be taken often without our knowledge or consent of how it will be used, and then used against us. And what we see is that the most vulnerable in our world are the ones who are most harmed by these types of data uses. However, this type of, you know, what Coldry is calling data colonialism is actually quite ubiquitous, albeit at sort of less stark levels. So Ruha Benjamin brings an example of how data sharing sounds like a very positive development. It's streamlining bulky bureaucracies of government, but access both goes ways. If someone is marked risky in one arena, that stigma follows him around more efficiently, streamlining marginalization. So she gives an example of someone who was denied a bank loan despite having high income and no debt, because the bank had access to her health file, which showed that she had a tumor. And so they were worried she wouldn't pay back this loan if she, for example, passed away. And so we're increasingly seeing, we know that, you know, for example, China has a very, very intricate kind of public scoring system that includes facial, like emotion recognition, facial recognition, and a high level of tracking. But we see this in the US as well. It's not as obvious, but we're seeing for example, health scores that are being collected from, for example, when you search WebMD or you search, for information about a health situation, or your credit card information shows that you've purchased certain, let's say, medicine, then that can be combined and sold to companies that, for example, are considering hiring you. Do they want to take you on as a risk on their health insurance, for example? Now, at the level, we're going to kind of jump another level and think about how about the layer of tech ideologies. And we see scholars, for again, Nick Coldry and his colleague Mejias, speaking about the assumption from our major tech companies that are led often, by often white men from US who have had a lot of, quite a bit of, grew up with privilege, and they have an assumption that they have kind of the right or even the gift or the calling to kind of shape the world according to their values. And, Nick Coldry talks about how this is really a kind of a colonial mindset that you could, move fast and break things, or that you don't need to have a plan. You can just try things. It's fine. You follow your passion. You do what you love. And we really see it's, also with the media, really a glorification of these tech leaders, and sort of recently in the last few years, we started to see a questioning of that. But, we still do hear a lot of glowing, coverage of, be it Bill Gates or, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg. And there's an assumption in the field that tech is progress, right? Like the more high tech we go, the better things are going to get. This kind of, you can compare it also with development theory, which is this idea that, everywhere, every country in the world, poor countries, they want to develop, they want to kind of reach the same level of the most developed Western nations, be that with democracy, be that with their economies, be that with their technologies. And there's this kind of assumption that this positivist assumption that we're all kind of moving on this trajectory and we're moving, towards a better place because thanks to our technology. And also that technology is like a major piece that can help take us there. And this also often discounts, both the things that are working amazingly well in so-called underdeveloped countries or so-called global south, the things that really are flourishing that might not be measured with a GDP number. And it also kind of, where there are challenges, it kind of often flattens those and proposes tech as a solution when actually, as many of us know, right, social problems complex, they often take complex solutions. And there can be a mismatch, again, if we think of just a simple example of language, a mismatch between the technology and what people, people around the world, the technology that they can actually use effectively and that would help them. And so we also see kind of a lot of rhetoric about like the big data revolution or artificial intelligence. It sounds so powerful, so impactful, so, groundbreaking. We need to be a little bit critical of that because of what it's kind of the kind of underside that it's hiding that may not be a great representation of what's actually happening. And we also see this kind of colonial connection of the ideology of tech, major big tech having very good intentions, but they happy to take credit when the Arab Spring was happening. At first, it was great, it was democracy. Yes, Facebook, social media, we were the ones that allowed these countries to be democratic. But there's a retrenchment of autocratic, governments. Oh, we don't have any responsibility for that. We don't have responsibilities for, ethnic cleansing or genocides because of that was used, or Facebook was used to call people together, like say in Myanmar, for example, but we don't take responsibility for that. And then we also see with such great wealth accumulation with these tech companies and an oversized impact on political processes. For example, Facebook was able to silence Trump in a way that no other, government institution was able to do in the US, for example. It means that these ideologies are increasingly impacting our world. And we also see kind of partnerships, sometimes out in the open, sometimes hidden, between companies and governments that really blur the line of corporate and state control. Now I want to kind of talk about, as we think about this idea of data colonialism and these kind of ideologies, how are they impacting sort of this cutting edge of artificial intelligence, as it's called, or machine learning? And we think about kind of how does this tie into our understanding of kind of colonial roots of much of this technology. So, I have some quotes here from Rachel Adams, who says, the conception of intelligence, whose conception of intelligence is modeled within technology? And as we know from like studies on IQ tests, for example, these are tests that are designed with a certain sort of cultural milieu in mind, and they have been used by eugenicists and people with, who want to argue that race is biological and that it differentiates us, and it's been used to try to support white supremacy, right? And when we look at our artificial intelligence and we say, okay, so if you have a very kind of narrow way of measuring what you call to be intelligence, and that's mapped onto AI, and we're going to be, dealing with dancing robots that have an intelligence model not after the amazing, myriad intelligences that we see, different types, social, musical, artistic, around the world, then how, what's going to be the impact of the machines that are working with this type of AI? And she goes on to draw on other scholars and talk about, really how the kind of the human body as machine and commodity born from slavery and colonialism, such that, excuse me, 1 second. Yes? Abid? Sarah Lining. Okay, sorry about that. That Blackness has been the prototype for the assemblage of the human object of modernity. So we see kind of this lineage. This is actually something that Ruha Benjamin talks about, how the robot is kind of taking the place of the sort of like, the labor that had been provided in the US previously by enslaved Africans, as well as the labor provided by colonial subjects, right? And so, it's kind of scary when you think about that genesis, and then what are these machines who are they being built to serve? And we can look back in history. I mean, we can look at current examples where data is being collected and used against people, but we can also look at historical examples. And Rachel Thomas, I'm going to share links at the end, but she has a really interesting set of YouTube videos about data ethics, data science ethics. And she brought this example of IBM, who partnered very closely with the Nazis far after other companies had broken ties, and helped them with their accountancy and classification with their genocide. And so we have to think about how the connection between these technologies and these kind of histories, as well as how they're being used in certain contexts today. We could think about the Uyghurs, we could think about what's happening now also in Myanmar with crackdown on activists against the now military government, for example. And then we see colonial patterns also in terms of the current development of AI. So, this has rightfully gotten a lot of press, the racial and gender kind of inadequacies and biases within facial recognition software, for example. So Joy Balumawini and Timnit Gebru, they published a work called Gender Shades that brought out how, you know, these software that were being sold to, for example, Border Patrol and police to recognize faces were, while they might be very accurate for white males, when they looked at women, when they looked at people of color, especially women of color, their accuracy quickly decreased. And Deborah Raji brought this kind of very, you know, kind of interesting example, looking at the heroines of the Black Panther film and showing how, you know, these software really, when it came to Black female faces, they had a high level of failure. And so we need to be thinking about how both our data sets, the reason for this, by the way, is because the data sets that were provided didn't include enough Black faces. And also we can see how often with data modeling, the way that the system is developed, it reflects the biases of the people who are building the technology. And so we see a lack of diversity within the tech sector can also lead us to have technologies that are biased against, you know, people who may not be represented in the tech sector and weren't there to actually fix those systems or point out where those gaps may be. And, you know, we see then, of course, this impacts the use of AI, right? So as I mentioned, you know, facial recognition is being used by police, by border patrols, by military, and there are certain cities as well as countries that are now either have banned or are considering bans or on this technology. But it's still being used in many other places. And, you know, one of the issues that we see, so if you take a technology that's not very accurate, let's say, and then let's say you're sending people, and there have been cases where people have been wrongly convicted of crimes because they were recognized by the system that misrecognized them. And then we also see that their automation bias is also playing a part. Now, automation bias is people's tendency to believe that machines are fair and that results provided to them by a system should be accurate. So if you provide, for example, a judge with information saying that this facial recognition system identified this person as X, then the judge is more likely to convict that person than if they just have human witnesses. And so you can see how the kind of amplification of any bias within this technology can really be very problematic, especially for our marginalized and most oppressed groups of people, historically and currently. And we also have to recognize that within these technologies, there are often trade-offs. So for example, if we say, okay, our facial recognition, it suffers from a lack of, let's say, you know, we haven't fed it enough data of people of color. Okay, well, we can do that. We could feed it more data so that it's better at recognizing people and identifying people of color. But then how does that actually give us a good outcome, or are we actually invading people's privacy? We're taking photos without their permission. They're feeding them into systems that may actually be used against them. And so Alondra Nelson talks about in her study about Black Panthers, not the movie, but the actual movement in the US, about a dialectic of surveillance and neglect. And we often see this in the technological realm when it comes to the marginalized and the oppressed. Tools are often designed, they're designed without those communities in mind, so they're just neglected so that we have digital divide, or they're designed to surveil and to make sure that those communities are, you know, staying within the boundaries that have been set for them. So how do we, let's try to think now, try to turn to more of a proactive conversation about how do we decolonize communication research? And, you know, I think this, as the people in this room, I'm sure would be familiar with, you know, we're in an ecosystem, right? And we're thinking about within academies, who is teaching these classes, right? Who is teaching about these topics? So, you know, I bring a certain perspective, other people bring their own perspective. So we need to have, you know, diversity of experience, diversity of expertise being taught. And then we have to think about what is being taught. What is the focus of this? You know, what topics, what theoretical frameworks, and then who are our students? Who are we recruiting? Who are being kind of fostered to become our next scholars? You know, are those people from a diversity of experience? And can they, when they see their professors, are they seeing, you know, do they see a path for them in the world of research? Do they feel like that's a place that they can be successful? And then in terms of choosing research topics for students and for faculty, for scholars, so who is being studied? What is studied? Based on what kind of frameworks, and in whose interest? Who's funding the research, right? Are we, you know, when we think about research, what is our aim, right? Is our aim, are we trying to serve a community? Are we trying to fill a gap in the field that, you know, maybe no one's ever done a study on, you know, the technology use of a certain community that you live in, you know, or are you trying to do research that, you know, would be where your audience is maybe quite external, it's maybe about prestige. These are very difficult things, again, kind of values in competition, and not to say one is right and one is wrong, but how can we, within the constraints of our lives, our livelihoods, how do we kind of push towards broadening the field so that we're, you know, we're serving the ends that we care about. And so whose lives, perspectives, and knowledge is valued? Are we seeing people that we study? Again, this is very colonial like language, right? The subject of the study, right? Are their knowledge valued? Are they seen as domain experts? Are their voices coming into our research? Are their perspectives? Is our research going to serve them and come back and be of use to them? And then who is supported in the academy and in the wider fields? Who gets published, who's mentored, who's funded, who gets promoted, who feels comfortable there, right? These all have an impact on the research that's going to be done. And then how about globally, the communication field as a whole? Are we empowering, or are we limiting participation from all parts of the globe? Or are our conferences in locations where people can't get visas? Are most respected institutions all in the West? Or, you know, are we starting to change this? And whose work is considered central and then added to the canon that then can be taught on to the next generation? So I want to thank actually Dr. Molale for sharing this resource. As I was saying, some of this work on decolonization is really recent, and I'm sure there's a lot of works that I'm not citing and that I haven't read, and I hope that you share that with me as well. But this is one that he shared with me, a really exciting edited volume about African communication studies. And the editors of this volume, Winston Mano and Viola Milton, they present their vision for decolonizing the field through Africology. And they have a few key points. So one is rediscovery and recovery. So in terms of research, we want to look at the lived experiences, the oral traditions, the language, the metaphorical sayings and proverbs of the silenced communities, their concepts and theories that can inform knowledge production. we want to look at naming the oppression and articulating its impact on one's own lived experiences and identity, such as loss of cultural memory, loss of language, etc. And reflecting and looking deeply and thinking critically about one's own position, avoiding, however, a self-consuming and non-productive stance. We have to be able to act, right? And then acting, unlearning one's privilege, learning to listen, understanding that in the communities where we conduct research, there are researchers, and they too can theorize, and they too have a right to the ownership of the knowledge they produce. And we can think about, what story do we want to tell with our research, and whose voice do I want to tell this story? And then they point out the interconnectedness of this Africology with aspects of the theoretical project of Afrocentricity, as well as its emancipatory roots wrested from the lived experiences of Africans in Africa and the diaspora, encourages epistemological recognition and conviviality, and as such holds great potential for engendering shifts in perspectives. And I love this word conviviality, because I think, you know, a lot of my presentation, I feel like it's very dark and scary. It's like the machines are gonna, you know, the data collection, and it's gonna be, you know, a new colonialism and the new power structure globally. You know, the countries are fighting to be at the top of AI and to control, you know, what people are thinking about, and to track it and to predict it. And while that may be true, I think Africa is a great place to think about the response to that, the creative response and the joyous response. And, you know, there's a lot of, even within the living memory, people's experiences of decolonization and how do you live, you know, your own life despite and in the face of many challenges. A next kind of proposal is from Milan and Cherry. So they have this big data from the South research agenda, and they bring a few points. So one is moving past the universalism associated with our interpretations of datafication. So, you know, this kind of goes back to these kind of the ideologies of the digital tech world, the sort of the positive messages, the rhetoric that comes out of the big tech companies, and the idea that all this, everything, the tech is universal. Once it's applied, it will do great things no matter where it's applied, you know? And we have to understand that, you know, lived experience is quite different when it comes to our communication and our technology from place to place. And that we should also understand, again, Global South, you know, understanding this as a composite and plural entity beyond just the geographical connotation. So they argue that, you know, when we look at people, again, these are interconnected issues, right? We're not just talking what happens in South Africa is linked and in very much can mirror what's happening in the US, for example, in certain ways, right? So we have people who are you know, struggling with the same kinds of oppression or similar types of oppression, similar types of power hierarchies, and also, you know, the response. So there may be links people can learn from one another. Global South, we can find it all over. And then they say there needs to be also a critical engagement with the decolonial approach. So, you know, this is, thinking about decolonizing is one lens through which to look at reality, but it's not the only lens. And they bring out other kinds of both of critical and lenses to look at the field. And they also, you know, really say we need to talk to the people that we're studying. How do they understand their experience? And we need to bring agency to the core of our analyses, not just necessarily look at the technology or the big institutions, the big tech companies, for example, but really look at the personal and the communal kinds of practice that goes on in relation to communication. And we need to embrace the imaginaries of datafication emerging from the South. So think about empowering ways of thinking about data from the margin. So, you know, how imaginaries is like, how do people understand their lives, right? How do they relate to Google Translate? How do they use it? how do they use their QWERTY keyboard? What are the inventive ways that they use to go around maybe some of the issues that I've mentioned? And they also point out, again, kind of beyond, within research, but also maybe beyond it, an alliance between the skilled learners on the ground, the people that we want to learn from when we do research, an alliance between them and the academic observers, so scholars, researchers, working toward a thorough Southern theory of change for the datafied society. And then I want to share with you Ruha Benjamin's Science and Social Justice Toolkit. And she's a scholar, an African-American scholar at Princeton, who I put her picture here because she's just an amazing orator. I would really encourage you to look her up and watch some of her lectures on YouTube. Just fantastic. So anyway, if you, she suggests this, she calls it shout, because you shout use this toolkit, she says. So she starts with these kind of different ways of approaching our subject matter. So first is social literacy. So she says, really, we want to read reality beyond the slogans, promises, policy changes, paying attention to the more mundane practices and norms that comprise everyday life. This kind of reminds me of some of the suggestions from the scholars I mentioned previously. We also need historical literacy. We need to think carefully about the precedents and processes that shape our current technologies. We shouldn't overlook continuities when we consider new or novel technologies. So this is kind of, we need to see that there are connections between colonial past and coloniality, colonial ways of, power hierarchies today, for example. But we shouldn't only look forward and be, amazed by the new technologies, but we also think about what's come before. And we need to appreciate the knowledge that communities have to offer in order to engage with a wider array of insights. Often the people we talk to, they remember, right? They can see patterns that we may not be aware of. And she talks about analytical agility, and she says, while we need that historical perspective, we also need to look forward and notice how and when things change. So there are those moments where things change. And this ability challenges our tendency to assume that the way that harms happened in the past will reoccur, and we focus on discontinuities. And she says, so for example, we can see liberal market-driven contexts in which personal choices reinforce oppressive hierarchies. So, it's hard to compare, let's say, a colonial reality where, you have a European power that is, extracting raw materials and labor from an African country. It's hard to compare that with Facebook, right? How is Facebook colonial, right? But if you look, because Facebook is, right, it's liberal, it's market driven. As a an individual, you can choose to go there and share your personal photos and communicate with your friends. Some of that, great, wonderful. But on the backside, as that data is being collected and then potentially used against people, do we see both commonalities in power dynamics as well as discontinuities? And she talks about linguistic reflexivity. And look at how language, the actual words that we use, actually contain values, and they tell us a lot about history and where we've come from, and the framings that we employ. When we talk about artificial intelligence, that's not a neutral term, right? It's actually seeded with particular perspectives. And then she talks about technological humility, which allows us to perceive and challenge the widespread hubris and paternalism that characterizes the world of technoscience. It highlights how norms and assumptions go unquestioned and alerts us to unintended consequences and how we can't know everything. And then I'm going to end with 7 commitments to decolonize the social sciences from Jess Auerbach, who is actually a colleague of some of you, I'm assuming here, who are from Northwest University. And I actually was privileged to hear her speak at a conference about 4 years ago. And she was one of the people that got me thinking about further ways for me to think about my research and how to decolonize what I was doing. So as an educator as well. So she argues that we need to assign open source materials in our classes because this both fights the extraction of African knowledge, where researchers do research in Africa and then they publish, and then that knowledge is no longer, their research is not accessible to people who provided them information and to others. So we need, as scholars, to publish open source, and we also need to assign that in our classes so that our students are not thieves, they're not stealing, they're not finding ways to break the law in order to gain access to knowledge, but rather we are bringing that information, that knowledge out into the open for them. And then we need to assign languages beyond English. So we need to assign texts in African languages. Excuse me. Many young people grow up. There's a huge, I believe it's 40% of students globally learn in a language that they don't speak. And so, I'm talking at the younger ages, but this still affects many students as they are doing their university education. And there's an association as well that, if you're not learning in your mother tongue, that your mother tongue isn't as, that it doesn't contain the same level of knowledge, and you can't think at the same level of sophistication in that language as you would in the language that you're learning in school. And that we need to combat this, because with the loss of language, we're also losing so much knowledge along with that, generations of knowledge. And then she argues that there needs to be a one-to-one student exchange ratio. I was privileged, I was able to come and study at Addis Ababa University, but how many, but as far as I knew, I remember asking as a student, is anyone coming back to Brown while I'm in Addis? No, the answer is no, right? Because of issues of visas and, currency exchange. And we really need to insist on this, that there's a mutuality in terms of how we are sharing experiences and sharing knowledge. And then she argues that text is not enough, and that we should be assigning non-textual sources of history, culture, and belief, because of course we have, for example, in Africa, we have so many oral languages, or languages that have been written in the modern time, which is, we find wonderful resources in literature, but we also need to look at how knowledge has been encoded into our architecture, into the artifacts that we use in our everyday life. Just as a bench can tell a story about social relations and wealth and disparities, how can the items that are built in each society tell us a story about how they design social relationships and communality, for example. And then she says we cannot work alone, and she required, and I know she worked with other colleagues at the time at the African Leadership Institute, I believe it was called, in Mauritius, assigning students to collaborate with a wide range of people so that they would have those experiences. They're not just in the ivory tower. They would be connecting with, people from their own community, people from the professions, to gain a wide range of experience. And then also training students to be producers and not only consumers. So be it writing op-eds or YouTube lectures or podcasts, having them engage and share their views and their knowledge through public dialogue in and about Africa. And then her last point was emphasizing ethics above all. And she felt that was really important to make, to position Africa, which has always been central to world economy and to knowledge production, but making it even more so within the kind of more formal sphere, making it central and respected based on the ethical kind of foundation of the research that's going on there. So I hope that my talk hasn't been too far over the time limit, first of all, and second, that that this can lead us to a project of collective imagination. How can we decolonize communication research How can we help our students? How can we think about our own work as students? How can we grow into a research that really speaks to us, that we are proud about, that we feel we're contributing, that we can then become mentors for the next generation as well. So thank you very much. I want to say Xavier Muskin I want to thank God for the ability for me to be here with you today, and thank everyone that's here in the audience and in the discussion that follows. I look forward to your insights and questions, and I want to thank all the scholars who I drew on today, and on all those who helped them build their knowledge as well, both cited and uncited, and also my husband, as I mentioned earlier, my family, as well as the wonderful hosts here with us today from Northwest University for giving me such a warm welcome. I'm happy to share my bibliography with anyone who would like. I collected quite a nice kind of library of materials if you want to do further reading in this area. And then I'd also like to thank, I borrowed images from a number of places to make my presentation more evocative and interesting.
Right. Thank you so much, Isabelle. Thank you so much for quite informative talk. You addressed several layers, and you touched on different, themes, and I like how you then now brought them to us. I know initially you had said you wouldn't want to give a depressing talk, the hopeless talk that we are colonized, they've taken this from us, they're exploiting our privacy and all. But at the end of the day, there's got to come, there's got to be some solution that we can bring. Just made me think about ICT for development, for example, technology solutionism, and how because it is rooted in modernization thinking, is it really good when we say we are bridging the digital divide? For who are we doing so? Are we doing so to still perpetuate, this technology colonialism, that data colonialism that seems to be inherent when you talk about digital tech and their influences over our lives? Thank you so very much for these interesting remarks. I'm not your respondent, by the way. Let me then, as a matter of fact, give over to Dr. Mutle, who will present to us our respondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulale, and thank you, Izzy, for this informative, we call it the talk, the discussion, the conversation, which I hope, therefore, from now onwards would also lead to other important discussions. As we engaged with you earlier, that we are attempting, therefore, to have a start. And I do believe that you have set the scene. Now we can go forward. Let us have this conversation. And in so doing, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to now welcome Professor Chaka, who's going to be our respondent. Just to quickly give you a brief bio of Professor Chaka. Professor Chaka is an associate professor and deputy dean teaching and learning at the Northwest University's Faculty of Humanities. He is also a communication science scholar with particular interest in corporate communication, reputation management, and development communication, where he continues to publish a lot. And he also supervises both master's and doctoral students. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our respondent, Professor Chaka. Prof.
Good evening, is early evening this time. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, Isabelle. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking talk. My role is merely simple, as I would just want to, in a way, add on to what you said, and also elicit some debates and some discussions to add to the discourse of decolonization within the South African context. You did, in a way, take us through most of your approach to where you are coming from. And it's important for us to look at our stance within South African context. To take you a bit from where we, as South Africans, started with the discourse of decolonization, decoloniality, and transformation of the curriculum, if you like. We started from the bigger scheme of things. The 2015-2016 Fallist movement started when the questions arose about your roads must fall. Then it went to the fees must fall. The issues of systemic violence came into being. But the fact of the matter is, after all that happened, we had to then question ourselves, make some sort of an introspection to say, where are we in the bigger scheme of things? How do we ensure that we do what we call then transformation of the curriculum? How do we decolonize our curriculum? Do we have the different types of knowledges that we can bring to the fore and in a way embrace those perspectives, and then we can impart those knowledges to our students? So conversations started in 2015, 2016, and to date we are adding to the discourse. You started quite well when you said, we cannot only talk about decolonization if we do not define it first. And then how do we then define it? We have to contextualize it within our context. To say, if you undo the injustices of the past, how do you begin to do it? If you acknowledge what has happened previously, how do you move ahead so that you can then bring a different sphere, a different fresh perspectives to the fore? And how comforting that we are now going beyond communication as a discipline, and then we add communication technologies, digital technologies. And within the African context, we know the national anthem of the 4IR that we are living within. So it is common cause that coloniality still exists within our curriculum today, within our disciplines today. But the fact that we are now broadening all these remarks and learning from emerging literature that you have looked at, it's really critical. But let's ask ourselves questions to say, how do we come into the space as South Africans, as young scholars, as communication practitioners, as communication students going forward? So the theories that these seminal works, the likes of the works of Winston Mano, Viola Milton, the Mafeges, you name them, it's critical for us to then start. But there's one catch. If we do not broaden those knowledges that are beginning, because we are in a way theorizing from the margins, if we want to move ahead. And there's a funny thing in South Africa where, say, when you do a study towards your PhD, because of the power relations that exist and coloniality that exists within our curriculum and within our communication context discipline, you work within a certain title or topic of your research, and when it is examined, perhaps it can be sent elsewhere in the world, Colombia, for example. And if we are not going to contribute the perspectives wide enough, those theories to add to the momentum of what we're trying to do, it might come and say, Africology, for example, that has been highlighted today as a theory, might not be known by Isabelle Zaugg in the other environment. So it's critical for us to continue these kind of debates. And now I call upon really students of communication, especially researchers, to say, how do we work, a little bit accelerate our approach to ensuring that our knowledge is also coming to the fore. You mentioned issues of communication technology, digital technologies, but I want to go to the issue of language injustice, or maybe justice for that matter. Within our context in South Africa and at Northwest University, for example, we have what we call the multilingualism project, where we're trying to say it's not only English that should be a medium of instruction. There are different indigenous languages that could be developed as well to ensure that there is some contribution as well from the indigenous side. But the project becoming slow because it starts from the mentality that we are not used to being taught in your indigenous language. So it's very difficult now to start from the step one of things to say, creating a bit of knowledge, you start with perhaps terminologies. How do you create terminologies in Setswana and Sesotho, Xhosa, Tshivenda, you name them, Sepedi and whatnot. And then start to create some sort of the knowledge that you need to ensure that it can be on the same standard as your English that is known in the world. So how do we then integrate all those into the technologies? I saw one of the questions here. Somebody was saying, how do we ensure that we capacitate perhaps those who do not have in order for them to create new technologies? And I looked at it and I said, I don't think it's about creating a new technology for us, but it's to use the same technology, the same digital platforms, but infuse them with our own understanding. Bring our perspectives to use the same technology to work for us as well. And you mentioned a very interesting aspect of digitalizing or digitizing language. How important is that? We have so much that we have read or we've heard about, but we are not using that because it's not out there for everybody to see. I can bet with you now, if we get a letter that was written in 19 whatever in Robben Island by Nelson Mandela, those in power are going to buy that to keep it to themselves. And they would want to own that. What are we doing about it? Are we not in the same position to say we also need that kind of knowledge? Maybe let's publish it and see how it will be of relevance to somebody else, my children tomorrow. So how do we digitize that? To preserve our forefathers' writing in order to lose prestige or not to lose prestige of our languages. It's really important. In other words, to turn the tables, is it possible? I said my role was to actually to just elicit more discussions into this and to add a bit of my perspective and to the discourse within the South African context. One of the things that has happened recently, looking at the technology that you spoke about, I had to travel with colleagues to China, and I realized in the other world, technology is more advanced, but how are they using it? And it goes back to the issue of some appreciating and some not appreciating because they think it's coming there to now take over from the people, perhaps the work and do other things. But as researchers, what are we doing about that? Let me remind colleagues and students here to say, remember communication when it started long time ago. from your AD. I don't want to go back to your history of AD, how it started, but because I wanted to show you that decolonization is indeed not a destination, but it's a process. World War I, World War II, what happened? Radio was the key aspect. And radio is a technology, yes it is. It was a key aspect into how we are doing things, or the world at that time, the war, how it was fought. So it's important for us to look at that and say, within communication research, for example, we talk about effects. The effects of communication, or the effect of any communication platform to us as individuals. We talk about media effects. So from there on, remember, they used to say, in order for Hitler to rise to power, it was through radio. In order for the Roosevelt to be the president, to persuade Americans to join, it was through radio. So it was that technology that was used before, but it has to be used today within a different context. Why are we then not using it to advance our languages? Why are we not using it then to advance our own perspectives, to develop our own or different languages that can be used throughout, so that we minimize that power that has been given? The tech companies that you spoke about is important, but they do not look at what speech recognitions would do things simpler for me to be able to say, even when I'm working and I'm speaking, I do not have to write this up, because it would, in a way, just type itself listening to my voice. And then I have a document tomorrow without going back. And that would solve my energy and time, for that matter. And then why is not research going to be the same as well? For us to be able to say, wow, in order for Google to pronounce my name, I have to do something for it to pronounce it properly. Why can we not ensure that the translation that Google does is we feed the information there, we feed our languages there to ensure that they do a good job? Anybody can try. Just write 2 sentences and say translate to any indigenous language. You'll see disaster. So because we are not feeding into that. So I'm including all this and saying we can add to the artificial intelligence. We can add to the automation that we see. Artificial intelligence, think about data analytics, think about Internet of Things. How do we ensure that we just contribute just a little bit from our perspectives to ensure that we minimize this decoloniality that exists, so that we stay away from the global north, and then we still talk about the global south, and we impactfully take it to ensure that the issues of how do we ensure that whatever that we do, we become producers of our own knowledge and not only consumers at the end of the day. I see we have just a few minutes. Lastly, I just want to say, for decolonization colleagues to continue, especially within the context of communication as a discipline, is far more nuanced than replacing theories and authors and perspectives and whatnot. What we need to encompass a broader educational experience in the mix is to ensure that we define our approaches, the development and the dissemination of the knowledge that we come up with. And only with that, we will be able to move forward with the process of decolonization. So with those words, I just wanted to elicit those responses and say, yes, it is a bigger debate that we need to have. We need more time. And for us to engage within a broader perspective of communication, all the things that you have talked about, to broaden the whole perspective of communication research as well into smaller segments for us to be able to say, at the end of the day, we have done justice and tomorrow we'll be proud of what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaka. You remind me of a number of things that we, between myself and you, have discussed on in relation to this particular important project. And I wish to thank you for the response given, that we have a task now. And ours is to now unpack what this project is all about. What does it entail in our own context? And where are we going as far as now understanding the alternative that we seek to bring to the fore? Simply because of there are a number of calls to say, let us now bring an alternative to what has been the dominant global North perspectives. And this alternative does not necessarily mean that we should simply push things to the fore simply because of we are able to at the moment. We should also consider the power relations, power dynamics, deal with infrastructure, deal with institutions, so that as when we begin now to say we are decolonized, we have dealt with the stumbling blocks and we are able therefore to give our own account, particularly as Africans, into this global context. Most importantly, your response now reminds me of what Collins Chassis and Rodney Gumete did in 2018, and they themselves have called upon us to, number one, understand the importance of our own scholarship. And we should therefore use the scholarship in a way that is grounded in what they call quintessentiality within the African philosophical insights, or to give those African philosophical insights. This is simply, according to them, an alternative to the global North dominance. And by so doing, I think, therefore, would be able to say a theory is not only a theory simply because of it emanates from Grunig, for instance. What does it mean to me? What am I teaching my students? Are they able to see the context? Are they able to relate to these stories? Or is it simply because of they need to consume this knowledge and move on? Therefore, we indeed have a task. Most importantly, Prof, and as well as to you, Isabelle, you guys affirm that decolonization presupposes transformation in what we call the intellectual discourses, in a sense that both the formal and informal content of teaching and learning, research endeavors, and all of this should be used, therefore, to service our own immediate communities by and large. And most importantly, and in line with the questions that we have also escalated, Professor Chaka, we also need now to ponder on the fact that who is in control of this knowledge? What is their role? How did they gain this role? What maintains their power, therefore, to ensure that they are able to hold on to this power of controlling this knowledge? And our own account into the bigger scheme of things would be able, therefore, somehow to ensure that we attempt to break this inherent and predominant knowledge carriers and holders. And most importantly, I think we now have a duty to do, particularly with us here within the communication science, and most importantly, within the global context as a whole, simply because decolonization, as we all put it, it's not a destination, it's simply a process, it's not a one-time event, it is continuous, and we need therefore to reflect on that continually. Most importantly, thank you, colleagues, for the insights that we have shared, Isabelle and Professor Chaka. I wish now to take the opportunity to invite other colleagues to share their questions, comments, input, so that we are able, therefore, to wrap up the discussion.